Black Op Radio presents John Armstrong. Now here is your host, Leno Sanek.
Control room, you're on the air.
Hello everyone, welcome to another episode of Black Op Radio. This is your host, Len Osanek, and today we're talking to author, researcher, John Armstrong. Hello, John.
Hello, Len.
Pleasure to be speaking to you. After all this time, we keep in touch via email, but I'm glad to have you back on, and you have an article. First of all, your website, harveyandlee.net. So if people want to find out about John Armstrong, harveyandlee.net, but we're going to talk about specifically The Two Marguerite Oswalds is an article that you have written, and it's up there, and we'll make links to it. But there's quite a few photos. There's a lot to the article, and it's kind of in depth. We're going to go over it audio-wise here and discuss it. I guess you're going to read from the article, and then every now and then, if you want to just stop and make some comment and talk about that, we can do that as well. You've supplied me with a few speaking points in that to make sure I don't forget. These are some of the important talking points that we're going to bring up. So with that introduction, I guess I'll just ask you, what was the first item that came to your attention that you thought this is something worth investigating here?
Well, it has to do with Harvey and Lee. When you investigate Harvey and Lee and you find, for example, John Pick being shown a photograph of Lee Harvey Oswald standing in front of the Bronx Zoo in 1953, and Pick says, "No, that's not my brother." So that's pretty interesting. And then the Warren Commission shows him other photographs, and no, that's not my brother, and so on. So that's back in 1952. And then you've got a photograph of 1952 in the springtime, in the sixth grade at Ridgely West Elementary School, Oswald's sixth grade photo. And he's certainly a very different looking person. He's tall, he's husky, very different from the photograph that was taken a year later. So if you've got two boys that are 12 years old, they can't live by themselves. They have to have people taking care of them. Lee Oswald's mother, obviously, Marguerite Claverie Oswald, is the mother of Lee Oswald. Now, you've got this short, thin, Russian-speaking boy. Who's his mother? Caretaker, whatever. So they have to have caretakers when they're 12 years old. That's what got me interested in looking into the background of Marguerite Oswald.
All right.
I will say this. I really hope that your listening audience can go to harveyandlee.net, go to the bottom of the page, look for the description, says the Two Marguerite Oswalds, and click on that. What we're going to talk about today is the audio version, the records, and the dates and times and places and so on where these two women were. My presentation is enhanced, if you will, by the photographs. It makes the viewer, the researcher, more accustomed to differentiating these two people. When you see photographs of Lee Oswald, whether it's from Oswald's book, Robert Oswald's book in 1958, where he's got this, husky football-looking player carrying a rifle, and then you look at the same year with thin Harvey Oswald wearing a helmet in the Marines, it's pretty hard to think that those are the same person. And when you see a tall, nice-looking Marguerite Oswald, who was constantly employed, constantly selling women's dresses and clothing, and an Avon representative and so on, working for large department stores. And then you see the historical Marguerite Oswald, you can see her standing next to Marina. She's shorter than Marina, who's 5'1", 5'2". She's much shorter, heavy set. She always wears glasses. Her physical features are very, very different. And when you read certain testimony of people who knew her in the 1930s and 1940s and simply could not believe it was the same woman on TV in 1963 that they had known just 9 years earlier, you start to see that, maybe something's really going on here. So you put all those pieces together, and that's basically what I've done. And you continue to do your research, continue to look at the documents, and just lay them side by side. The problem is that when you're doing research in this particular area, you're actually dealing with not two people, but three so-called people. And what I mean by that is, you've got, for example, Lee Harvey Oswald. Then you've got a Russian-speaking Lee Harvey Oswald who substituted because he spoke Russian and went to Russia and so on. But then you've got the third part, and that's the Warren Commission's Lee Harvey Oswald, where they take information from the real Lee Harvey Oswald and from Harvey Oswald and piece it together to make a third invented person, if you will, that's a combination of both real people. So this is not easy. It's not easy for me sometimes, but it's not easy to follow. It's taken me years and years to come to the point where I am. And when you look at Marguerite Oswald and the woman who impersonated her, it's the same thing. And what I'm about to present to you is very, very detailed information. Now, it has to be detailed. You have to be able to show on a particular date, a particular time, a particular place, one person was here and one person was there. I'll give you, for example, that's going to come up in this presentation. Many of our researchers know that, the Marguerite Oswald that we know, the historical Marguerite Oswald, worked for King Candy Company, had a jar fall on her head, and then she was unemployed, and she went to this doctor and that doctor and tried to get workers' comp and so on. Well, when you piece all these things together, when you put everything in order, what you find is the accident happened on December 5th, 1958. She's unemployed all the way through the entire year of 1959 and part of 1960. Remember, she was trying to get her son, the Russian-speaking Harvey Oswald, out of the Marines early to come back and take care of her. That was the whole purpose of the jar falling on her head. So what you've got then is very detailed stuff, and you have to be able to understand the background, very, very detailed, so that when you are reading other FBI reports, other Warren Commission testimony, something will strike out at you and you'll say, oh my gosh. Well, just keep in mind, in this, for example, that Marguerite Oswald, historical Marguerite Oswald, was unemployed for the entire year of 1959. Now here you've got, in 58 after December 5th, and she was working for King Candy Company, which was in the Fair Ridgely department store in Fort Worth, beginning in August 1958. All right. Now here you've got John Pick talking about taking his family and driving from the East Coast to San Francisco to catch a boat to go over to Japan. And Pick says, we stopped at Mother's house Halloween night. And that I visited her the next day. She was selling clothes at Cox's department store. Well, that's just a statement. And most people, and I'm not trying to sound like a smart aleck, most people just look at it and say, okay. Well, to me, that's very, very significant. Cox's department store, selling dresses, is not working at King Candy Company in the Fair Ridgely store. It's two separate, department stores. So now we have John Pick telling the Warren Commission that he personally visited his mother, Marguerite Claverie Oswald, selling dresses at Cox's department store the day after Halloween, 1958. Then you got Robert Oswald's testimony. And they asked Robert Oswald when the last time he saw his mother. And Robert Oswald said it was the second Saturday in April, 1959. Where was she working? She was working at Cox's department store. Well, you put those two things together, and you've got the mother of Robert and John Pick working at Cox's department store from the fall of 1958 through the summer, late spring, summer of 1959. Wait a minute. I thought Marguerite Oswald got a jar knocked on her head and she was unemployed for the entire year of 1959. So when you put those two things side by side, something's wrong. You've got John Pick's and Robert Oswald's mother working at Cox's department store for 8 months, while the other Marguerite Oswald, the one that we know as the historical Marguerite Oswald, was unemployed. That's the type of things that I'm looking for. The two different women, two different places, same time.
Well, let's start with your presentation then.
Okay. I really hope that people can follow this, follow the photographs, follow the documents as I'm reading. All right. As students of the assassination of President Kennedy, it is important to suspend for a moment the details on the ground in Dealey Plaza in order to understand a period of unprecedented change in America in the post-war period, 1945 to 1963. That world was becoming an increasingly scary place. In August 1945, the world's first atomic bombs were dropped over Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The British Empire was in a state of collapse. A new world order was being shaped with two superpowers locked in an ideological struggle. The new American foreign policy of containment and the domino theory were being taught to children. A March 1946 poll showed that 60% of Americans believed that U.S. policy towards Russia was too soft. Winston Churchill delivered his Iron Curtain speech on March 6, 1946. His famous image served to define the world in a pair of binary opposites. A new national security network was invested with virtually unlimited powers as the Central Intelligence Agency was created on July 26, 1947. In a climate of fear that extended through the McCarthy era, the prevailing view was that extraordinary circumstances called for extraordinary measures. It appears as though Americans were willing to accept secrecy from their government in return for keeping everyone safe. It was in this world in the late 1940s that a relatively inconsequential Cold War intelligence operation unfolded with the purpose of planting a Russian-speaking American spy in the Soviet Union. Now, this story has nothing to do directly with the assassination of President Kennedy, but it has everything to do with understanding the true identity of Lee Harvey Oswald and Marguerite Oswald. For hundreds of years, secret agents and spies have been used to confuse, mislead, deceive, in order to acquire sensitive military information. Spies often assume the identity of a person who died as a child, died in battle, or simply disappeared. However, there are many problems when a spy assumes the identity of a dead person. The main problem has always been the inability to trace the biography of a spy back to their families, to their childhood, and to their birth. A comprehensive background investigation of a suspected spy will uncover their true identity and will also uncover the identity of the person whose identity they assumed. A basic requirement for infiltrating a spy into a foreign country is that he or she speak and read the local language fluently. After all, it would be pointless to send an English-speaking spy into China, Russia, the Middle East, unless they spoke and read the language. Tens of millions of people were killed in Europe during World War II, which resulted in tens of thousands of refugee children from many different countries. Thousands of these underage children, who spoke only their native languages, were relocated to the United States and placed with foster families. One of these children, in my opinion, was a 6, 7, or 8-year-old Russian-speaking boy who was placed with a middle-aged woman caretaker in New Jersey and or New York. In the early 1940s, Marguerite Collaborate Oswald, the mother of John Pick, Robert Oswald, and Lee Oswald, was working for the U.S. Navy in Algiers, Louisiana, across the river from New Orleans. One of her sons, Lee Harvey Oswald, was only 2 years old, born in New Orleans on October 18, 1939. Marguerite soon met Edwin Ekdahl, an electrical engineer who worked for Ebasco Services Company in New York City. One of Ebasco's projects was the design of a large electrical generation station in the Soviet Union, which suggests this company worked closely with U.S. intelligence. In 1964, following the assassination of President Kennedy, the FBI requested information from Ebasco related to the employment of Mr. Ekdahl. The FBI was told that Basco was unable to provide such information. In 1945, Marguerite Claverie Oswald moved to Fort Worth and married Ekdahl. 2 years later, in the summer of 1947, while living with Ekdahl and her 3 sons at 1505 8th Avenue in Fort Worth, another Marguerite Oswald was living at 101 San Saba in Benbrook, Texas, with a young Russian-speaking boy who was given the name Harvey Oswald. What follows is a detailed biographical study of a government-sponsored caretaker who I call the Marguerite Oswald imposter, who was given the job of taking care of young Russian-speaking Harvey Oswald. For the next 12 years, this imposter and Harvey lived in close proximity to Marguerite Claverie Oswald and her son, Lee Harvey Oswald. As these young boys lived nearby in the same cities, often attended the same schools, and later spent time in the Marine Corps, both Harvey Oswald and Lee Oswald had established very similar backgrounds. At age 18, the plan was to have Russian-speaking Harvey Oswald assume the identity of American-born Lee Harvey Oswald. Harvey would then defect to the Soviet Union, where his native Russian-speaking ability would be invaluable. The Russian KGB, if concerned or curious about this American defector, would then be able to track back Lee Harvey Oswald's background to his birth. The mother of Lee Harvey Oswald and the caretaker imposter mother of Harvey Oswald were part of what CIA accountant James Wilcott called the Oswald Project, a highly secret American intelligence operation crypto-named RX-ZIM, Z-I-M. The intent of the Oswald Project was to send a young man who secretly understood the Russian language to the Soviet Union with a U.S. identity. The American public was never supposed to know anything about Harvey Oswald, the second Lee Harvey Oswald, or the Marguerite Oswald imposter. The following sheds light on both the 2 Lee Harvey Oswalds as well as the 2 women who served as their mothers. It dates back to as early as 1947. Now I'm looking at the photos in my harveyandlee.net. Above left is Marguerite Claverie Oswald, the tall, attractive, well-dressed mother of Lee Harvey Oswald. In the photo, you can note her horizontal eyebrows, her wide smile, and her pleasant appearance and dress. On the right is the caretaker of Harvey Oswald, the young man who was accused of assassinating President Kennedy. This short, heavy-set imposter switched identities with Marguerite Claverie Oswald in 1959 in preparation for Russian-speaking Harvey Oswald's defection to the Soviet Union. This imposter was very short, around 5 foot tall, had very slanted eyebrows, a small mouth, was heavily set, poorly dressed, and almost always wore glasses. Marguerite Claverie Oswald, the mother of Lee Oswald, was born in New Orleans on July 19, 1907. She married Edward Pick in 1929, with whom she had a son, John Pick. Marguerite and Pick divorced. Marguerite soon married Robert E. L. Oswald in 1933, with whom she had 2 sons, Robert Oswald, Lee Harvey Oswald. Marguerite was relatively tall, about 5'6", 5'7", attractive, well-groomed, always nicely dressed, was continually employed, had straight horizontal eyebrows, a wide smile, and was never known to wear glasses. On May 7, 1945, Marguerite Claverie Oswald and Ekdahl were married in Rockwall, Texas. The photo below on the left shows 5'6" Marguerite Oswald and 5'11" Ekdahl standing in front of Ekdahl's 1938 Buick on their wedding day. The photo in the middle shows Marguerite and Ekdahl in 1947. The photo on the right is of Marguerite in 1949, standing in front of her car at 101 San Saba in Benbrook. Marguerite Claverie Oswald was a steadying influence on her son Lee Oswald, who always had a history of good attendance at schools in Fort Worth and New Orleans. In 1947, Marguerite Ekdahl was living with her husband and son, Lee, in the upstairs apartment of a duplex at 1505 8th Avenue in Fort Worth. In the summer of 1947, 15-year-old John Pick worked at Walgreens and then at the Tex Gold Ice Cream Parlor 4 blocks south of their apartment. By the end of the summer, John Pick was promoted to assistant manager. In the fall of 1947, Lee Oswald attended the nearby Lily B. Clayton Elementary School. We've got his picture in the class picture. The Oswalds, Pick, Robert, Lee, spent the entire Christmas holidays of 1947 at 1505 8th Avenue with Ekdahl. Now, 1947 was a very important year for the Oswald family. On July 7th, 1947, Marguerite Claverie Ekdahl purchased a small home at 101 San Saba in Benbrook, Texas, a suburb of Fort Worth. The photo on the left shows the tall, nicely dressed Marguerite Claverie Ekdahl standing in front of her car, a 1938 Plymouth. The photo on the right shows the same car, a building in the background, and the caption that reads, Blackie, 1949. Blackie's the dog laying sitting on the ground. The building in the back was a small motel owned by Mr. Sells. Both photos were taken at 101 San Saba in Benbrook, a house which Marguerite owned and rented during the next 4 years. In the spring of 1948, Marguerite Claverie Oswald left Edwin Ekdahl, filed for divorce, and moved to a small home at 3300 Willing in Fort Worth. On March 19th, Lee Oswald transferred to the nearby George Clark Elementary School in the 2nd grade. In June, Marguerite Claverie Oswald began working at Leonard's Department Store, later at W.C. Stripling Company. According to John Pick, the family briefly lived at 101 San Saba in the summer of 1948. In September, Marguerite purchased a home at 7408 Ewing in Fort Worth, where they lived for the next 4 years, and soon began work at Texas Prudential Insurance. The home was occupied by Marguerite, John Pick, Robert, and Lee. In July 1949, Marguerite Claverie Oswald was assistant manager of the Lerner Store in Fort Worth. November 22nd, she began working as the Literary Guild and operated a booth in Cox's department store. In January 1950, John Pick joined the U.S. Coast Guard, left home, and was assigned to Cape May, New Jersey. In June, Marguerite Claverie Oswald began working for McDonald's Kitchens as a hostess. In September, she was working for the Joseph Luker Agency. Now, researchers should note that the FBI did a very good job in piecing together Marguerite Claverie Oswald's work history in the 1940s through the 1950s. We know the dates, we know the people she worked for, we know the time she worked. On November 1st, 1951, Marguerite transferred title to 101 San Saba to Otis Carlton, and on November 15th, 2 weeks later, she purchased a small house at 4833 Birchman, 6 blocks from Stripling High School, another rental house. On July 15th, 1952, Robert Oswald left home and joined the Marines. 1 month later, on August 20th, Marguerite sold her home at 7408 Ewing, where she lived for the past 4 years. 2 weeks later, Marguerite Claverie Oswald and her son, Lee, drove their 1948 Dodge to New York City and moved in to John Pick and his wife's small apartment in Manhattan. John Pick told the Warren Commission that Lee Oswald enrolled in a school close to the Pick's apartment. John Pick said the school was between 89th and 90th Streets and between 2nd and 3rd Avenue in Manhattan. Lee Oswald's older brother wrote in his book, Lee, page 63, Lee entered the 8th grade at Public School 44 on Columbus Avenue at 76th Street in Manhattan. PS, by the way, means public school. The Warren Commission ignored John Pick's testimony, ignored Robert Oswald, and instead chose to rely on black and white photographs of Oswald's school records given to them by the FBI. These photographs showed that Lee Oswald attended Public School 44, but not in Manhattan, as reported by John Pick and Robert Oswald. The photographs given to the Warren Commission showed that Oswald attended Public School 44 in the Bronx in 1953. Now, it's interesting to note there was a public school 44 in each of the 5 New York City boroughs: Manhattan, Bronx, Queens, Brooklyn, and Staten Island. It would have been very easy to place Lee in Public School 44 in Manhattan, place Harvey in Public School 44 in another borough at the same time. Following the assassination of President Kennedy, New York City Judge Florence Kelley obtained Oswald's original New York City school records. She allowed the special agent in charge of the FBI's New York office, John Malone, to review those records and to make notes, but only in her presence. Later, after conferring with colleagues, Judge Kelley gave Oswald's original New York City records to Malone, and those records disappeared. The FBI provided the Warren Commission with black and white photographs of Oswald's school records, which the Warren Commission accepted without question. In January 1953, the House Un-American Activities Committee file in New York City made a reference to a Mrs. M. Oswald in a CIA Office of Security file. This file contained references to 1941, Nazis, and New Jersey. Judge John Tunheim of the Assassination Records Review Board wrote to Henry Hyde and requested the HUAC file on Mrs. M. Oswald, but his request was denied. In February, John Pick and his family were invited to dinner at the Oswald's apartment. This was the last time John Pick would see his brother for 9 years. The next time John Pick saw Lee Harvey Oswald was in 1962, when Pick was invited to Thanksgiving dinner at Robert Oswald's home. And this is where he met the Russian-speaking Harvey Oswald. Pick testified and told the Warren Commission, quote, "The Lee Harvey Oswald I met in November 1962, Thanksgiving, was not the Lee Harvey Oswald I had known 10 years previous in New York." When the Warren Commission showed John Pick photographs of Harvey Oswald taken in 1953, 1957, and 1963, he refused to identify these photos as his brother. Robert Oswald most certainly knew that the Russian-speaking Harvey at Thanksgiving in his home in 1962 was not his brother. This is because Robert Oswald had lived with both Harvey and the Marguerite Oswald imposter at 4936 Collinwood for 6 months in 1956. In January 1954, Marguerite Claverie Oswald and Lee Oswald relocated from New York to New Orleans, where Lee enrolled in Beauregard Junior High and was assigned to homeroom 303. Marguerite rented an apartment at 1454 St. Mary's from her longtime close friend, Myrtle Evans, and began work at Burt's Shoe Store. Myrtle Evans and Marguerite had known each other for 20 years. Myrtle saw and talked with Marguerite and Lee Oswald nearly every day when they lived in her apartment building in 1954. Myrtle said, quote, "Marguerite was a very good housekeeper, very tasty. She was always so lovely herself. She was beautiful." Myrtle's husband, Julian Evans, said of Marguerite, "She was a fashion plate." In late summer 1954, Marguerite Claverie Oswald and her son moved to 126 Exchange Place in the French Quarter. According to neighbor Mildred Sawyer, Marguerite was working at Krieger's department store and later at Gold Rings. Now, let me just say that Gold Rings is very important because, as we will see, Marguerite Oswald worked on and off at Gold Rings 1954, 1957, 1958, 1960. She had continued employment for Gold Rings. But the FBI never interviewed anyone at Gold Rings and never obtained any employment information relating to Marguerite Claverie Oswald from Gold Rings. In the fall of 1954, Lee Oswald became friends with Ed Vogel, joined the Civil Air Patrol 6 months later in June 1955, and got a full-time job at the Jared F. Tujak Company, a local freight forwarder. Lee Oswald's supervisor, Frank DiBenedetto, told the House Select Committee on Assassinations that Oswald worked at Two Jacks a year to a year and a half, from June 1955 through the summer of 1956. The FBI, however, said Oswald worked at Two Jacks less than 2 months. On July 31st, 1956, Marguerite Claverie Oswald terminated her employment at Gold Rings. Lee Oswald quit his job at Two Jacks and told his boss, Frank DiBenedetto, that he was going to join the Marines. John Pick told the Warren Commission that Robert Oswald drove to New Orleans, picked up his mother and brother, and drove them to Fort Worth. Marguerite rented an apartment at 3830 West 6th in September 1956. Robert Oswald was then living a few miles away at 4936 Collinwood with a Marguerite Oswald imposter and Harvey Oswald. In October 1956, Lee Oswald joined the Marines and visited his mother at 3830 West 6th, apartment number 31 on leave. Marguerite's neighbor, Mr. Lee McCracken, told the FBI that Lee Oswald resided with his mother on 2 or 3 occasions when on leave from the Marines. Marguerite obtained employment at Clyde Campbell's men's store and later at Paul's shoe store in Fort Worth. During 1957 and 1958, Marguerite was also a sales representative for Avon Products and visited the homes of fellow co-workers. I'm looking at a photograph that was given to me by the assistant manager of Paul's shoe store, taken at Christmas time in 1957. The photo on the right is a blow-up of Marguerite Oswald, who's standing in the photo with other store employees. In the spring of 1958, Marguerite Claverie Oswald left Paul's shoe store and began working for Family Publications. In the fall, she began working for Cox's department store on Camp Boy Boulevard on the west side of Fort Worth. A year later, in the summer of 1959, Marguerite Claverie Oswald quit Cox's department store and moved to New Orleans. Once again, she obtained employment with Krieger's department store and Gold Rings. Mrs. Logan Magruder, who had known Marguerite since 1943, saw and talked with her at Krieger's. When interviewed in 1964, Mrs. Magruder told the FBI that she met and visited with Marguerite about 3 years ago, around 1960. Mrs. Oris Duane, who used to be Marguerite's supervisor at Jean's hosiery shop in New Orleans, was interviewed by the FBI in 1964. She told the FBI that 3 or 4 years ago, circa 1960-61, Marguerite stopped by Lady Oris Hosiery, where Mrs. Duane was store manager. Marguerite told Mrs. Duane that she was working at Gold Rings department store selling dresses on the second floor. These two women, longtime friends of Marguerite Claverie Oswald, placed the real Marguerite Claverie Oswald in New Orleans in the early 1960s. The FBI now had information that Marguerite Claverie Oswald was working at Gold Rings and Krieger's department stores in the early 1960s. To confirm her dates of employment, the FBI only needed to secure employment records from Gold Rings and Krieger's, interview management and coworkers. The FBI could also obtain canceled payroll checks from Gold Rings and Krieger's, as well as state income tax records from the state of Louisiana. But if the FBI had conducted an honest investigation concerning Marguerite Claverie Oswald's employment in Fort Worth and New Orleans from 1956 to 1963, those records would have conflicted with the Marguerite Oswald imposter's various residences and employment in New Orleans and Texas at the same time. Local FBI agents thoroughly investigated Marguerite Claverie Oswald's employment from the 1940s to the mid-1950s. They interviewed employers, co-workers, and beginning and ending dates of her employment. But in 1956, their investigation of Marguerite Claverie Oswald and her employment ended because their investigation was now focused on the Marguerite Oswald imposter. While Marguerite Claverie Oswald was living in New Orleans in the summer of 1959, the Marguerite Oswald imposter was unemployed and living in Fort Worth. In fact, when researchers look closely into the work history of the Marguerite Oswald imposter, they find that during most of her life, she was unemployed. She was unemployed in 1947 while living in Benbrook and did not have a car. There's no record of her employment in New York in 1952 and 1953. And there's only one record of her employment in New Orleans from 1954 through 1956, and that was when she worked a few months at Dolly Shoe. And then she was fired from Dolly Shoe because she wouldn't fill out detailed personal information for the insurance company. In 1959, Russian-speaking Harvey Oswald was in the Marine Corps in Santa Ana, where he constantly spoke Russian and talked about Cuba, Castro, and communism in preparation for his upcoming defection to the Soviet Union. In September, Harvey Oswald was discharged from the Marines, secured passage on a boat to Europe, and obtained a visa to enter the Soviet Union. A month later, after his defection became public, the press focused their attention on his mother, the Margaret Oswald imposter, who was living in Fort Worth, while the real Margaret Oswald, Margaret Clavery Oswald, was living in New Orleans. Now, Lee Oswald, unlike his mother, who was quietly living in New Orleans, remained visible after Harvey Oswald's defection to the Soviet Union. Lee Oswald used his real name and participated in Cold War shenanigans in Florida, Louisiana, Texas, and New York. These activities in 1960 and 61 raised an alarm bell at the FBI and caused J. Edgar Hoover to believe that an imposter was using Oswald's identity because Harvey Oswald was in Russia. Now I'm going to talk about the Margaret Oswald imposter. I'm looking at a photo taken around 1956. This is the Margaret Oswald who testified before the Warren Commission, claiming to be the mother of Lee Harvey Oswald. She was, however, an imposter. This woman was not the mother of Harvey Oswald. In fact, was physically in stark contrast to the much taller, attractive, pleasant, well-dressed mother of Lee Oswald. In the latter half of the 1940s, this woman became the caretaker of a young Russian-speaking boy who was relocated to the United States by an agency of United States intelligence. The young boy was given the name Lee Harvey Oswald, while this unidentified and unknown woman, the caretaker, was given the name Margaret Oswald. Their assignment was to mirror the lives of Margaret Clavery Oswald and her son, Lee Oswald, for the next 10 years. They accomplished this by living in close proximity, which provided Harvey and Lee an opportunity to attend the same schools. The goal was for both boys to live and experience very similar backgrounds. As young adults, Russian-speaking Harvey Oswald would then switch identities with Lee Oswald for the purpose of defecting to the Soviet Union. In the Soviet Union, Russian-speaking Harvey Oswald could gather information and act as a spy on behalf of our Central Intelligence Agency. These two Oswald families were the central figures in the Oswald Project, a plan created by U.S. intelligence to place a young Russian-speaking American person inside the Soviet Union. The Margaret Oswald imposter was short, around 5 feet tall, heavy-set, poorly dressed, and appeared to be many years older than Margaret Clavery Oswald. She first appeared with Harvey Oswald in Benbrook, Texas, a suburb of Fort Worth, in June 1947. They moved into a small house at 101 San Saba that was recently purchased by the real Margaret Clavery Oswald, who was then living with her husband, Edwin Ekdahl, at 1505 8th Avenue, 7 miles away. Now, I met and visited with Georgia Bell in 1995. Georgia was 83 years old and still living in the home that she and her husband had built in 1947 at 100 San Saba, directly across the street from 101 San Saba. Georgia remembered the short, heavy-set Margaret Oswald imposter very well. In fact, I was curious, and I showed her a picture of the short, heavy-set Margaret Oswald, and I showed her a picture of the Margaret Oswald taken in 1957 at Paul's Shoe Store, and another photograph that was taken in about 1946 in Dallas when they lived on Victor Street. Mrs. Bell identified the photograph of the short, heavy-set Margaret Oswald. That's her. And I showed her the other two photographs of Margaret Clavery Oswald. She said, I don't know who that is. Anyway, Georgia said that Marguerite had a young son, did not have a car, did not have a job, and occasionally worked as a practical nurse. Georgia said that Marguerite often had male visitors who arrived by car. Georgia often purchased groceries for Mrs. Oswald, while neighbor Lucille Hubbard would, on occasion, drive Mrs. Oswald to her former residence at 2220 Thomas Place to pick up clothes. Georgia said that Mrs. Oswald left around Thanksgiving 1947, and the small house was then rented to a family named Charbonneau. Georgia Bell lived at 100 San Saba for the next 49 years and knew all of her neighbors very well. The owner of 101 San Saba, Margaret Clavery Oswald, continued to rent this home for the next 4 years. Georgia recalled that when a neighbor's house burned down, the neighbor moved into 101 San Saba. The neighbor was Otis Carlton, who eventually purchased the home from Marguerite on November 6, 1951. So she owned the home for 4 years and rented it for 4 years. In the fall of 1952, the Margaret Oswald imposter and Harvey were living in New York City, where, according to New York school records published by the Warren Commission, Lee Harvey Oswald briefly attended Trinity Lutheran School and then briefly attended Public School 117. In January 1953, while Harvey and the Margaret Oswald imposter were living in the Bronx, there are indications of CIA involvement. Again, the House American Activities Committee had a file that made reference to a Mrs. M. Oswald, New York City, that originated from a CIA Office of Security file. The file contained references to 1941, Nazis in New Jersey. Judge John Tunheim of the Assassination Records Review Board wrote to Henry Hyde and requested the HUAC file, but his request was denied. Now, again, in February 1953, John Pick and his family were invited to dinner at the Oswald's apartment. This was his mother. This is the last time John Pick would see his brother, Lee. 9 years later, in 1962, Pick was invited to Thanksgiving dinner at Robert Oswald's home, where he met the Russian-speaking Harvey Oswald. Pick wasn't fooled. Pick told the Warren Commission, quote, "The Lee Harvey Oswald I met in November of 1962 was not the Lee Harvey Oswald I had known 10 years previous. When the Warren Commission showed John Pick photographs of Harvey Oswald taken in 1953, 1957, and 1963, passing out leaflets in New Orleans, he refused to identify these photos as his brother. But Robert Oswald most certainly knew that the Russian-speaking Harvey was not his brother, because Robert had lived with both Harvey and the Margaret Oswald imposter at 4936 Collinwood for 6 months in 1956. We'll get into that in a few minutes. Harvey Oswald failed to attend either Trinity or Public School 117 regularly, was adjudged truant, and placed in the youth house in the spring of 1953. Now, this is just very interesting, because if you look at the school records given by the FBI to the Warren Commission, you will find the number of days that Oswald attended Public School 44. Plot them on a calendar. It's very easy. And guess what? There's no time whatsoever that Oswald was adjudged truant, no time for him to have been placed in the youth house or attended court. You've got Lee Oswald attending Public School 44 regularly, and Harvey Oswald truanting and being placed in the youth house. I'm looking at 2 photographs. The photograph on the left is of Lee Oswald in the 6th grade in 1952. The photograph on the right is Harvey Oswald, much shorter, much skinnier, in 1953. The photo below on the left shows the tall, 5'2", husky, well-built Lee Oswald. 1 year later, in 1953, New York City school records recorded his height at 5'4". The same year, 1953, the photo on the right was taken of the short, 4'6", thin Harvey Oswald at the Bronx Zoo. His height was described to me by Dr. Milton Curian, a psychiatrist who interviewed Oswald in April of 1953 when he was at the youth house. Now, let's be clear. The Marguerite Oswald imposter was the caretaker of Harvey Oswald from 1947 through his enlistment in the Marine Corps in 1956. While Harvey Oswald was truanting and later placed in youth house, Lee Oswald was attending public school 44 with a near perfect attendance record. In fact, Lee Oswald attended school, held jobs, and served in the Marines for extended periods. While Harvey Oswald's involvement with schools, jobs, and the Marines was very sporadic. The Marguerite Oswald imposter was interviewed at the youth house by probation officer John Carl. During this one interview, this Marguerite Oswald imposter made countless mistakes about her family background, mistakes that the real Marguerite Oswald would never make. Following are a few biographical mistakes made by the Marguerite Oswald imposter during this one interview. The Marguerite Oswald imposter told John Caro that she was the youngest of 6 children, yet there were 5 children in the Claverie family. She gave Lee Oswald's father's name as Robert Lee Harvey, when his real name was Robert Edward Lee Oswald. She said Lee's father died at age 45, yet we know he was 43 when he died. This imposter gave her marriage date as July 19, 1929, yet she married Robert Oswald in 1933. She gave her sister's name as Lillian Segore, when we know her sister's name was Lillian Moret. She said she formerly owned a house in Corning, Texas, yet there is not and has never been a Corning, Texas. She gave Lee Harvey Oswald birth date as October 19th, when the correct date was October 18th. She said Lee was baptized at the Trinity Lutheran Church in New Orleans, when records show he was baptized at the Redeemer Lutheran Church. When this imposter was asked whether Lee's father was right or left-handed, she replied, "I do not remember, sir." Marguerite Claverie Oswald, the mother of Lee Oswald, would never have made these mistakes concerning her background. But probation officer John Caro interviewed the Marguerite Oswald imposter, and this woman was not prepared to answer detailed questions about Marguerite Claverie Oswald's background. In the summer of 1953, a few months after Harvey Oswald was released from youth house, the unemployed Marguerite Oswald imposter and Harvey left New York City and resided briefly in Stanley, North Dakota. Marguerite Claverie Oswald and her son Lee were still living in New York City. It was in North Dakota that Harvey became friends with William Henry Timmer and talked about his involvement with teenage gangs in New York City. Teenage gangs, New York City, 1953. This was when Harvey was truanting from school. In the fall of 1953, the Marguerite Oswald imposter and Harvey left North Dakota and moved to New Orleans, where they resided at 126 Exchange Place in the French Quarter. Harvey began attending Beauregard Junior High part-time in the 8th grade in the fall of 1953, part-time, while the Marguerite Oswald imposter worked briefly as a barmaid, where little personal information or payroll tax information was required. 5 months later, in January 1954, while living at 126 Exchange Place, Harvey Oswald began attending junior high school, Beauregard Junior High School, full-time, and was assigned to the homeroom of physical education teacher Myra DeRoos. There's a YouTube video with my interview of Myra DeRoos. You can watch it. Myra only had a homeroom for a single school year while she taught at Beauregard, and her homeroom is located in the basement, a room that also served as a school cafeteria. During the same year, Lee Oswald, while living at 1454 St. Mary's, attended the spring semester of the 8th grade at Beauregard Junior High School and was assigned to homeroom 303 on the 3rd floor of the building. Homeroom 303 is written on every one of his report cards published in the Warren volumes. As strange as it may seem, Harvey Oswald with his homeroom in the basement cafeteria, and Lee Oswald, homeroom 303, were both in the 8th grade at Beauregard Junior High at the same time during the spring semester of 1954. In the fall of 1954, the Margaret Oswald imposter and Harvey left New Orleans and moved into an apartment at 2220 Thomas Place, a duplex in Fort Worth. It is worth remembering that the Margaret Oswald imposter had furniture and clothing stored at the same address in 1947 when she was living in Benbrook. Here she is again in 1954, living at 2220 Thomas Place. And then, believe it or not, on November 22nd, 1963, she was again living at 2220 Thomas Place. Harvey began attending the 9th grade at Stripling Junior High, which is directly across the street. Harvey was remembered by classmates Doug Gann, Jackie Pitts, Bobby Pitts, Roy Park, and Fran Schubert. There's an interview, my interview of Fran Schubert, standing at Stripling and when we're doing the interview. Physical education teacher Mark Summers, also enrolled in the 9th grade at Stripling at the same time, was Peter Gregory, who would later befriend Harvey and Marina after they arrived in Fort Worth in June 1963. Peter Gregory's father, of course, was native Russian, and Peter Gregory studied Russian at the University of Oklahoma. He would befriend Harvey and Marina after they arrived in Fort Worth in June 1963. Fran remembered that Harvey was thin, short, wore a leather jacket, and his mother always wore a white nurse's uniform. In October 1959, after Harvey Oswald defected to the Soviet Union, Robert Oswald was interviewed and told the Fort Worth Star-Telegram that his brother had attended Stripling Junior High. 3 years later, in June 1962, when Harvey Oswald returned to the United States from the Soviet Union, Robert Oswald was again interviewed and again told the Fort Worth Star-Telegram that his brother had attended Stripling Junior High School. In 1964, when interviewed by the Warren Commission, Robert Oswald once again said that his brother had attended Stripling Junior High School. Robert Oswald knew very well that Harvey Oswald had attended Stripling Junior High. But Robert Oswald did not realize that at the same time his real brother, Lee Oswald, was attending Beauregard Junior High School in New Orleans. This was a huge problem. On November 23, 1963, the day after President Kennedy was killed, Assistant Principal Frank Cudlady gave Harvey Oswald's school records, Stripling records, to the FBI. I interviewed Frank Cudlady. You can see the interview on YouTube. In 1995, I called and spoke with Ricardo Galindo, then the principal of Stripling Junior High. Mr. Galindo told me, quote, "It's common knowledge among staff and faculty that Oswald attended Stripling." Today, however, the FBI denies they have any records of Oswald's attendance at Stripling. The Stripling records had to disappear because if made public, they would show that Lee Harvey Oswald attended Beauregard Junior High School in New Orleans, while at the same time, Lee Harvey Oswald was attending Stripling Junior High School in Fort Worth. This attempted cover-up was far from perfect, but it managed to fool the Warren Commission, but did not fool Mr. Cudlady or students who knew that Harvey Oswald had attended Stripling. In January 1955, Harvey Oswald and Margaret Oswald imposter left Fort Worth and returned to New Orleans, where both began working full-time for Mari Goodman at the Dolly Shoe Store on Canal Street. Mrs. Oswald was asked to fill out detailed personal information required by the store's insurance company. She ignored the request. A few months later, when asked to fill out detailed personal information, the Margaret Oswald imposter once again refused and was fired. Newly hired store manager Louis Marzali, I interviewed Louis. His interview is also on YouTube. Recalled that after Mrs. Oswald's employment was terminated at Dolly Shoe, he saw her working as a barmaid at the Tradewinds Bar on Decatur Street in New Orleans. I'm looking at two photos. The photo on the left is of the Margaret Oswald imposter in 1954. And you just mustn't look at her extremely. downward slanting eyebrows, almost 45 degrees slanted downwards. This striking and distinct facial feature was later hidden by her ever-present large-frame glasses. The much taller and thinner Marguerite Clavery Oswald, the mother of Lee Oswald and Robert Oswald and John Pick, her eyebrows are nearly horizontal, as can be seen in the photo on the right, taken at Paul's shoe store in 1957. And she never wore glasses. In the fall of 1955, Harvey Oswald briefly attended Warren Easton High School in New Orleans. Now, this is important because at the same time, from June 1955 through August 1956, Lee Oswald was working full-time at the Jared F. Tujak Company. On October 7th, a handwritten note was delivered to Warren Easton that read, quote, "We are moving to San Diego in the middle of the month. Lee must quit school now." Years later, in the fall of 1963, when Harvey Oswald was interviewed by Texas Employment Commission worker Laura Kittrell, Harvey discussed living in Encino, California, and working for 6 months at ETI Realty. While Lee Oswald was working for Tujak's in New Orleans from 1955 through 1956, Harvey Oswald attended Warren Easton High School. And then he and the Margaret Oswald imposter probably moved to California, where they lived for 6 months. In January 1956, Harvey and the Margaret Oswald imposter somehow returned to New Orleans, where Harvey Oswald briefly worked at the J.R. Michaels Company in the Sandlin building. I say somehow because there's no evidence that the Margaret Oswald imposter ever owned a car until 1961. Marguerite Clavery Oswald, on the other hand, was known to drive a car and own a car in the early 1940s, late 1940s, all the way up through the 1950s. Lee Oswald was still working full-time at the Jared F. Tujak Company, which was located one floor above J.R. Michaels in the same building. Incidentally, when I visited with Frank DiBenedetto, Oswald's boss at Tujak's in the Sandlin building, they were in the same office where they had been in 1956 when they employed Lee Harvey Oswald. One floor below was J.R. Michaels' company, where I met with Nick Mazza, who was the office manager, same location, same office, for 40 years. Nick was approached by the FBI shortly after the assassination, said, "We want Lee Harvey Oswald's records." And Nick Mazza told him, "Lee Oswald never worked for us." Now, what Nick Mazza told me next was something he didn't understand. He says, "The FBI told me, yes, he did work here. Go check your records." So Nick went and checked his records. And he found one check that was made payable to Lee Harvey Oswald in January 1956. Now, Nick did something that very, very few people ever did when confronted with the FBI. Before Nick gave the FBI the original check, he copied the front and back side of it. And he still had that copy 35 years later when I met him. And he gave me a copy, which is in some of my records at Baylor University. Anyway, the point is that Lee Oswald was working for Tujak's on the 4th floor at the same time Harvey worked for a week at J.R. Michaels' company, one floor below. 6 months later, in June 1956, Harvey Oswald and the Margaret Oswald imposter left New Orleans and moved to Fort Worth, where they rented an apartment at 4936 Collinwood for Mrs. James Taylor. 22-year-old Robert Oswald moved in with Harvey Oswald and the Margaret Oswald imposter. On July 13th, Robert opened a bank account at the Westside State Bank and listed his address as 4936 Collinwood. Robert was then dating Veda Mercer, who he would marry 5 months later in November. But Robert never introduced Veda to the Margaret Oswald imposter, nor to Harvey Oswald. This makes sense, because Harvey Oswald was not Robert's brother, and the Margaret Oswald imposter was not his mother. In my opinion, it was during this time, while living in the apartment for 6 months with the Margaret Oswald imposter and Harvey Oswald, that Robert Oswald learned that Harvey had attended the nearby Stripling Junior High. After Harvey Oswald defected to the Soviet Union, that's why Robert Oswald told news reporters that his brother had attended Stripling Junior High. 4 years later, he told the Warren Commission that his brother had attended Stripling Junior High. Robert Oswald did not realize that when Harvey was attending Stripling Junior High School in Fort Worth, in September-October 1954, his real brother, Lee Oswald, was attending Beauregard Junior High School in New Orleans at the same time. On July 31st, 1956, Marguerite Claverie Oswald quit her job at Goldring's department store in New Orleans. Now remember, the Margaret Oswald imposter was already living at 4936 Collinwood. She rented the apartment on June 1st, 1956. Robert Oswald was living with her. Now, Lee Oswald, after working a year at Two Jacks, told Frank DiBenedetto he was quitting in order to join the Marines. According to John Pick, Robert Oswald drove to New Orleans, picked up his mother, Marguerite Claverie Oswald, and his brother Lee Oswald, and drove them back to Fort Worth. Marguerite rented apartment number 3 at 3830 West 6th, where she lived for the next 2 years. This address was given to the Marine Corps, to the Red Cross, to the Fort Worth Retail Merchants Credit Association, and appeared in the Fort Worth City Directory. A neighbor, Lee McCracken, remembered that Lee Oswald visited his mother on 2 occasions while on leave from the Marines and stayed in the apartment with her for about 2 weeks each time. A month later, Harvey Oswald, living a few miles away at 4936 Collinwood, enrolled as a sophomore in Arlington Heights High School. 6 weeks later, in October, Harvey dropped out of school and joined the Marines at age 16. A few weeks later, in November, Robert Oswald married Veda Mercer, and the Margaret Oswald imposter was now living alone in the apartment. Veda told the FBI, quote, she never met Lee Harvey Oswald prior to their marriage. And just as interesting was that neither Harvey Oswald nor the Margaret Oswald imposter attended Robert Oswald's wedding in November. Now, this makes perfect sense now that we know Margaret Oswald imposter was not Robert's mother and Harvey was not Robert's brother. The Margaret Oswald imposter, now living alone, continued to live at 4936 Collinwood until July 1st, 1957. Her neighbor, Mrs. Enoch, said that Margaret Oswald told her she'd been fired from 2 jobs while living at 4936 Collinwood. On May 29, 1957, the unemployed Margaret Oswald imposter was still living in Collinwood. On the same day, Marguerite Claverie Oswald applied for employment at Leonard's department store. The Retail Merchants Credit Association, at the request of Leonard's, reported that Margaret Oswald was and had been living in apartment number 3 at 3830 West 6th in Fort Worth since August 1956. On July 1st, 1957, the Margaret Oswald imposter left 4936 Collinwood, but owed her landlady for unpaid utility bills. On 3 separate occasions, Mrs. James Taylor, the landlady, drove to 1031 West 5th, where the Margaret Oswald imposter was living, but she always refused to pay the utility bills. In the fall of 1957, the unemployed Margaret Oswald imposter left Fort Worth, traveled to New Orleans, and moved into the Senator Hotel. Harvey Oswald, in the Marines, was attending aviation electronics school in Memphis with fellow Marine Alan Feld. Harvey Oswald left the Marines, traveled briefly to Yellow Springs, Ohio, and may have sat in on classes at Antioch College. Sergeant Donald Schwartz of the Intelligence Unit of the Columbus, Ohio Police Department had information that Oswald briefly attended classes at Antioch College, which was also attended by Ruth Payne. In late September, 17-year-old Harvey Oswald was living with the Marguerite Oswald imposter at the Hotel Senator on Dauphine Street in New Orleans. Harvey began working at the Pfister Dental Laboratory directly across the street, where he met co-worker Palmer McBride. On October 4th, 1957, Harvey and Palmer McBride discussed this Russian launching of Sputnik, the first satellite to orbit the globe. On October 12th, Harvey and Palmer attended the Boris Godunov Opera in New Orleans. During the Christmas holidays of 1957, Harvey Oswald attended the first of several meetings of the New Orleans Amateur Astronomy Association with his friend and co-worker Palmer McBride. At the same time, Marguerite Claverie Oswald, the mother of Lee Oswald, was still working at Paul's shoe store in New Orleans, where she was photographed at Christmas time with store employees. In early 1958, Harvey Oswald accompanied Palmer McBride to his home one evening. As Harvey and McBride talked, mostly about communism, their conversation began to focus on recent Russian space successes and the virtues of communism. McBride's father, after hearing Harvey Oswald praise the communist way of life, became upset and demanded that he leave their home. On May 17, 1958, a $1,000 life insurance policy on Lee Harvey Oswald lapsed due to non-payment of the premium. On June 10th, the National Life and Accident Insurance Company notified Mrs. Oswald of the policy lapse by letter addressed to 126 Exchange in New Orleans. Now, we must remember that Lee Oswald, in the Marines, in Japan, his mother was living at 3830 West 6th in Fort Worth. So this letter was delivered 3 weeks later. It was received in New Orleans at 126 Exchange and delivered 3 weeks later to Lee Oswald in Japan, who was then in the brig, the Marine Corps brig. On June 30th, 1958, while incarcerated in the brig in Atsugi, Lee Oswald applied to the company for reinstatement of the policy. He listed his address as Marine Corps Magdis in San Francisco and listed his mother's address as 126 Exchange Place in New Orleans. Now, the application was witnessed by fellow Marine Peter Cassisi, who later told the FBI, quote, he did not recognize Lee Oswald, the man in the brig, as a former Marine associate when he saw pictures of Harvey Oswald that were published in the media after the assassination. Two different people. Harvey Oswald and Margaret Oswald imposter were likely residing at 126 Exchange in June 1958. It's about the time when Paul McBride said that Harvey Oswald quit working at the Pfister Dental Laboratory. McBride told me, I spent a lot of time with Palmer. He's a very good guy. He worked for the NASA for like 25 years. Palmer said that Oswald quit the Pfister Dental Laboratory about 2 months before he joined the Air Force Reserves, which was August. So it appears that Palmer's memory was correct. They were probably living at 126 Exchange in June. They got the letter, sent it to Lee Oswald. Letter was returned, sent on to the insurance company. Now, it is worth remembering that Marguerite Claverie Oswald was living at 3830 West 6th in Fort Worth. And the Margaret Oswald imposter, 4936 Collinwood, lived nearby each other from August 56 through June 57. In early October 1957, the Margaret Oswald imposter and Harvey were living at the Hotel Senator in New Orleans, across the street from the Pfister Dental Laboratory, where Harvey worked with McBride. At the same time, Margaret Claverie Oswald, the mother of Lee, was still living at 3830 West 6th in Fort Worth and working at Paul's shoe store. When Harvey and the Margaret Oswald imposter left New Orleans and returned to Fort Worth in the summer of 1958, Margaret Oswald was still living at 3830 West 6th and was now working at Family Publications. Now, after Marguerite, Margaret Oswald imposter, returned to Fort Worth, she began working for the King Candy Company on August 20th, 1958. She turned in an employment application, said she just moved to Fort Worth from New York. And she listed several personal recommendations. So the FBI interviewed the manager of the King Candy Company. And he told the FBI, well, she moved here from New York, had very good references, very good employment history according to what she gave us, so we hired her. Well, obviously that's very phony. She didn't just come from New York, she came from New Orleans. She left New York in 1953, 5 years earlier. Anyway, she was hired to sell candy at the King Candy Company in a booth at the Fair Ridge department store in West Fort Worth. At the end of October, the Margaret Oswald imposter was still working at King Candy. Again, on Friday, October 31st, Halloween, John Pick and his family spent the night at his mother's home while driving to the West Coast. Pick told the Warren Commission that during their stopover in Fort Worth, he visited his mother, Marguerite Clavery Oswald, while she was working at Cox's department store selling women's clothing. Pick's mother's working at Cox's department store. The Margaret Oswald imposter is working at the King Candy Company. On December 5th, while working at King Candy, the Margaret Oswald imposter claimed that a jar fell on her head, causing injury. She visited several physicians in December, and on January 30th, 1959, told Dr. Milton Goldberg that her son, the Russian-speaking Harvey Oswald, wanted to defect to Russia. In February, she visited 2 more doctors, and the following months, she received treatments. March 16th, 18th, 20th, 23rd, 25th, 27th, and 30th. In April, she received treatments the 2nd, the 4th, the 6th, the 11th, and was referred to Dr. McKinney and Dr. J.C. Baxter. On April 20th, the Margaret Oswald imposter filed a notice of claim for compensation with the Industrial Board of Texas. On May 9th, she had x-rays taken at the Fort Worth Osteopathic Hospital. May 19th, Liberty Insurance suspended compensation payments. On October 4th, the Texas Industrial Accident Board ordered Liberty Insurance to pay her $29 per week for 12 weeks. Unsatisfied with the result, Margaret Oswald imposter hired an attorney and filed suit on August 11th. Now, following her so-called injury on December 5th, 1958, the Margaret Oswald imposter was unemployed for the entire year of 1959. While the Margaret Oswald imposter was unemployed and busy visiting doctors, Robert Oswald told the Warren Commission that he visited his mother, Marguerite Clavery Oswald, at Cox's department store on a Saturday in April 1959. This is Warren Commission testimony. Robert Oswald and John Pick placed their mother at Cox's department store in the fall of 1958, and both men saw her working when they visited Cox's department store in the spring of 1959. Clearly, the tall, nice-looking, well-dressed Margaret Oswald once again works at a department store selling women's dresses, while the Margaret Oswald imposter is unemployed and was unemployed for the entire year of 1959. Let me recap this one more time, very quickly. The Margaret Oswald imposter was working for King Candy Company, August through December 1958, and was then unemployed during all of 1959. At the same time, Marguerite Clavery Oswald, mother of Lee, Robert, and John Pick, was working at the Cox department store from the fall of 1950 through the summer of 1959. 2 Margaret Oswalds living in Fort Worth at the same time, working for different companies. In August 1959, the Margaret Oswald imposter applied for a hardship discharge to the United States Marine Corps so that her son, the Russian-speaking Harvey could return to Fort Worth and care for her. The Margaret Oswald impostor, pictured below, was now the one and only Marguerite Oswald. She would claim to be the mother of Lee Harvey Oswald, who would soon defect to Russia and 4 years later be accused of killing President Kennedy. The two photos below, which I'm looking at, taken 6 years earlier and 3 years earlier, are of Marguerite Claverie Oswald, mother of John Pick, Robert Oswald, and Lee Oswald. Once again, notice her near straight horizontal eyebrows, her wide smile, no glasses, and no mole under her right eye. Harvey Oswald now switches identities with Lee Oswald. There's a photograph that I'm looking at of each of these young men, taken just a few months apart. In the fall of 1958, after briefly working at a local shoe store, Harvey Oswald left Fort Worth, re-entered the Marines, and was sent to Atsugi, Japan. On September 14th, Harvey Oswald boarded the USS Skagit for Taiwan, accompanied by Marines who never knew or were associated with Lee Oswald, completely different outfits. On October 6th, Harvey Oswald was listed on Marine Corps Unit Diary 158-58 at Pingtung, South Taiwan. When later interviewed in Moscow by reporter Priscilla Johnson, Harvey said, "After I finished high school, I joined the Marines at 17. I was in Japan, the Philippines, Indonesia, and Formosa," which is the Dutch name for Taiwan. While Harvey was in Taiwan, Lee Oswald remained in Japan and made repeated visits to the Atsugi Station Hospital on September 16, 20, 22, 23, 29, and was admitted to the hospital on October 6. On October 5th, Harvey Oswald left Taiwan and returned to Japan. In late October 1958, while Lee Oswald was still in Japan, Harvey Oswald arrived at MAX 9 in Santa Ana, California, where he was examined at the base hospital. Harvey was stationed at the Leiden Air Facility in Santa Ana, where there were 600 to 700 Marines, and he would remain there until discharge in September of 1959. On November 2nd, 1958, while Harvey was at the Leiden Air Facility in Santa Ana, California, Lee Oswald was in Yokosuka, Japan. The following day, Lee Oswald boarded the USS Barrett and arrived in San Francisco on November 15th. After his leave, Lee Oswald was stationed at the Marine Corps Jet Base in El Toro, 5,000 Marines. Now, according to Major William P. Gorski, the Assistant Provost Marshal at the Marine Corps Air Station at El Toro, Lee Harvey Oswald was discharged from the Marines in March 1959. Lee Oswald discharged from the Marines in March 1959 is extremely important because Harvey Oswald remained in the Marine Corps base at Santa Ana, California, and was not discharged until September 11th, 1959. Lee Oswald was out of the Marines, and his mother, Marguerite Claverie Oswald, was living in New Orleans and working at Gold Rings department store. The Margaret Oswald imposter was living in Fort Worth, where she would remain for the rest of her life. Russian-speaking Harvey was now stationed with a group of Marines in Santa Ana, California. Marines who had no contact with Lee Oswald in Japan. Different people. Harvey had switched identities with Lee Oswald. Harvey was now the one and only Lee Harvey Oswald. He soon began to speak Russian to fellow Marines, read Russian newspapers, listen to Russian records. He took and passed a Russian language exam and expressed interest and sympathy for Cuba and communism. Very soon, the CIA's plan of placing a Russian-speaking American in the Soviet Union would become a reality. Russian-speaking Harvey had successfully switched identities with American-born Lee Oswald. Harvey Oswald became the historical Lee Harvey Oswald, who defected to the Soviet Union, returned to the U.S. with a Russian wife and child in June 1962, and was accused of killing President Kennedy. From 1947 through 1958, the Marguerite Oswald imposter and Harvey were shadow-like personas of Marguerite Claverie Oswald and Lee Oswald. These two families lived in the same cities and often at slightly different times at the same addresses. Harvey and Lee often attended the same schools, were both in the Marine Corps, both attended radar school at Keesler Air Force Base in Biloxi, Mississippi, and on occasion had the same friends, again at slightly different times. For example, and this is not in my write-up, but for example, it was Lee Oswald who knew David Ferry in the CAP in 1955, but it was Harvey Oswald who knew David Ferry in 1963. This was the CIA's Oswald Project, and the intent was to merge the identity of a Russian-speaking youth, Harvey, with the background of an American citizen, Lee Oswald. Once complete, the Russian-speaking youth, Harvey, could be verified as born in the U.S., raised in the U.S., and a former Marine. Lee Harvey Oswald was now ready to defect to the Soviet Union, where his proficiency in the Russian language would be invaluable. The Margaret Oswald imposter moved continuously, had no close friends, purchased her first car in 1961, and was never able to hold a job for more than a few months, and almost always worked for cash. This woman, known to the public as Margaret Oswald, mother of Lee Harvey Oswald, was an imposter. Even though her real name and identity remained unknown, she was the caretaker of Russian-speaking Harvey Oswald, whose real name and identity also remain unknown. I'd like to talk for just a minute or two about John Hart Ely. John Hart Ely was a dedicated 25-year-old staff attorney for the Warren Commission. His assignment was to gather background information on the Oswald family. Ely wrote, quote, "My purpose was to obtain a chronology based on then existing data in our files of the background facts, life, school, places of residence of Mrs. Oswald, her several marriages, her husbands, her 3 children, and in particular, Lee Harvey Oswald. Ely relied on and trusted the documentation given to the Warren Commission by the FBI was genuine. Ely had no reason to mistrust the FBI. But Ely soon realized the FBI was providing little information on Oswald and his family background. After reading a detailed description in Life magazine of Oswald's life in Fort Worth, Ely wrote a memo to his boss and said, quote, "We're getting more information from Life magazine than we are from the FBI." In another memo, Ely wrote, quote, "Once again, let me urge that we should not have to rely upon Life magazine for such a list. The FBI should undertake a systematic identification and interview of Oswald's closest school friends." Unfortunately, Ely never realized that the FBI's failure to provide accurate background information on Lee Harvey Oswald and his family was intentional. Mr. Ely was apparently never aware of the ongoing collusion between the FBI and the Warren Commission. Unknown to Ely was an agreement between the Commission and the FBI that allowed FBI agents and officials to review and correct transcripts of their testimony before the Commission. For example, the correcting of FBI lab technician James Cadigan's testimony helped to conceal the fact that Oswald's possessions, a total of 225 items, confiscated and inventoried by the Dallas police on November 22nd, were secretly sent to the FBI on November 23rd. 3 days later, after numerous items of evidence had been altered, modified, substituted, or simply added, the FBI returned a total of 455 items to the Dallas police. These items were then jointly inventoried by the FBI and Dallas police, and a detailed report was given to the Warren Commission. The Commission apparently never bothered to compare the Dallas police list of Oswald's possession, 225 items, to the 455 items inventoried 3 days later. The Warren Commission was apparently unaware that many of the items returned to the Dallas police had been altered and manipulated. The Warren Commission was apparently unaware that the FBI received 225 items of evidence, but returned 455. Many, quote, items of evidence were added and not only helped to frame Harvey Oswald as the man who assassinated President Kennedy, but also helped to conceal the existence of a second Oswald. By the way, it wasn't James Cadigan who took a pencil, scratched out, and corrected his testimony. It was Alan Dulles. Among the 455 items of evidence returned by the FBI were fake W-2 forms, J.R. Michaels, 2 Jacks Pfisters, all typed with the same typewriter. These documents were created for the purpose of merging the employment records of Harvey and Lee. The FBI simply had to create these fake documents. Harvey Oswald worked with Palmer McBride and others at Pfister Dental Lab in New Orleans from October 57 through May of 1958, while Lee Oswald was in Japan. The FBI solved this problem by creating a fake W-2 form to show that one Lee Harvey Oswald worked at Pfister's in 1956 before joining the Marines. This fake W-2 form was not found by the Dallas police among Oswald's possessions. This fake W-2 form was among the 455 items of evidence returned to the Dallas police by the FBI on November 26th. The next W-2 that was faked was for 2 Jacks. Now, Lee Oswald working at 2 Jacks for an entire year from June 55 through August 1956 was a serious problem. Because at the same time, Harvey attended Warren Easton High School in the fall of 1955, worked for J.R. Michaels in 1956, was apparently in California for a few months, working at the ETI Realty Company, and he may even have worked briefly for the Pfister Dental Laboratory. FBI officials, fully aware of 2 Oswalds, now had to explain Oswald's school and work history to the Warren Commission. After receiving Oswald's possessions on November 23rd, the Bureau created 2 fake W-2 forms for 2 Jacks. These forms that Lee Oswald showed that Lee Oswald worked a short time for 2 Jacks, not a year to a year and a half, as reported by his boss, Frank DiBenedetto. These fake W-2 forms, not found by the Dallas police, were among the 455 items of evidence returned by the FBI to the Dallas police on November 26th. The Warren Commission simply pieced the FBI's fake evidence together and were now able to show that one Lee Harvey Oswald attended Warren Easton High School in September 1955. Then he worked for a couple of months at 2 Jacks in November, December. Then he worked 1 week for J.R. Michaels. And then he worked for an unknown period of time at the Pfister Dental Laboratory. The FBI, by creating these W-2 forms that match Oswald time cards, was able to merge the work and school history of Harvey and Lee. In addition to manipulating, creating, and laundering physical evidence, the Bureau convinced the Warren Commission to accept photographs in lieu of physical evidence. This gave the FBI a much-needed opportunity to alter and or destroy the original evidence, such as Harvey and Lee's original school transcripts from New York and New Orleans, employment records for Harvey at the Dollar Shoe, Pfister Dental Laboratory, and 2 Jacks, and the employment records in New York City, New Orleans, and Fort Worth for the 2 Marguerite Oswalds. Photographs of laundered evidentiary items provided to the Warren Commission eliminated the possibility that original evidence, when properly examined, could have revealed alterations or fabrications. Now, the FBI provided the Warren Commission, John Hart Ely, with carefully screened and laundered evidence, photographs, and reports concerning the background of Marguerite and Lee Oswald. However, Mr. Ely on his own interviewed Marines who knew and had personal contact with Lee Oswald. Ely came very close to realizing there were 2 Lee Harvey Oswalds after interviewing Marines who knew the tall, husky Lee Oswald at El Toro, while the short, thin, Russian-speaking Harvey was stationed at Santa Ana. After Ely interviewed Alan Graff, who served with Lee Oswald at the Marine Corps base in El Toro, Ely wrote, quote, "He, Graff, is equally clear that they were stationed together at El Toro and not Santa Ana. They were, he says, stationed with Marine Corps Headquarters Group 3 Airport Radar Team 1 and were not at the Leiden Air Station in Santa Ana. Graf gave Eli the names of several Marines who he and Oswald had known and worked with, but these names were not familiar to Eli. Eli wrote, quote, "Moreover, the names he mentioned as having been in his unit are not those generally mentioned as having been in the unit after Oswald returned from Japan." Graf then provided the names John Castle, Raymond Glidden, James King, Abraham Rubenstein, Gauthier, Hurd, Malden, Sacha, who all knew and had worked with Lee Oswald at El Toro. Eli was confused by Graf's statements and did not understand that Graf had served with Lee Oswald at the jet base, while at the same time Harvey Oswald was stationed at the Leiden Air Facility at Santa Ana. Neither Eli, the Warren Commission, FBI, or the House Select Committee interviewed any of the Marines who served with Lee Oswald at the Marine Corps jet base in El Toro. Their stories and memory of Lee Oswald remain unknown, as do Lee Oswald's Marine Corps records and unit diaries from El Toro. The FBI and Warren Commission limited their investigation to Harvey Oswald and the Marines with whom he worked at the Leiden Air Facility in Santa Ana. But there was one Marine at El Toro, interviewed by the FBI, who could have provided Eli with the information that a second person named Lee Harvey Oswald was stationed at El Toro. That man was Major William P. Gorski, the Assistant Provost Marshal at the Marine Corps Air Station at El Toro. If Mr. Eli had known and contacted Major Gorski, he could have examined records that showed Lee Harvey Oswald was discharged from the Marines at El Toro in March 1959. These records would have placed Lee Oswald at El Toro and confirmed Alan Graf's association and memory of Lee Oswald. But Eli also had Marine Corps records that showed Lee Harvey Oswald was discharged from the Marines at Santa Ana in September 1959. Eli was very close to obtaining information and records that would have exposed Lee at El Toro, while at the same time Harvey was stationed at Santa Ana. Unfortunately, Mr. Eli never read the FBI's report, nor did he meet Major Gorski. Mr. Eli did, however, manage to uncover contradictory information relating to the historical background of Lee Harvey Oswald and his mother. He prepared and wrote a detailed chronology relating to Oswald and his family background that alarmed members of the Warren Commission. On April 10, 1964, Senior Counsel Albert Jenner wrote a memo to General Counsel J. Lee Rankin, which read, in part, quote, "Our depositions and examination of records and other data disclose that there are details in Mr. Eli's memoranda which will require material alteration and, in some instances, omission." The advice of the Warren Commission's General Counsel is clear. Alter or omit certain background information on Oswald, his mother, and his family. Jenner's memorandum confirms that the Warren Commission intentionally altered or omitted information relating to Oswald and his family. Now, the FBI agents interviewed the neighbors, friends, and employers who knew and worked with Marguerite Claverie Oswald from the early 1940s to the mid-1950s. The majority of her employment was working in sales at hosiery shops, department stores, shoe stores, a well-dressed, people-oriented woman with a continuous work history. The Bureau appears to have conducted a thorough investigation of her work and family background, but only through the mid-1950s. FBI agents interviewed Lee McCracken, a neighbor of Marguerite's who lived in the same four-unit apartment building at 3830 West 6th from 1956 through 1958. McCracken knew Marguerite and told agents that Lee had visited his mother on 2 or 3 occasions while on leave from the Marines. But after interviewing Mrs. James Taylor, owner of a small apartment building at 4936 Collinwood, the FBI became aware of a serious problem. Mrs. Taylor told FBI agents that she rented an apartment to Margaret Oswald from June 56 through June 1957 and then contacted her at 1031 West 5th in late summer 1957. Mrs. Taylor also said that her two sons, Robert Oswald and Lee Oswald, lived with her in the apartment. The FBI had reports that showed there were two Margaret Oswalds living close to each other at the same time in Fort Worth for over a year. And then you have Mrs. Taylor saying that one son, Robert Oswald, lived with his mother. You've got another, McCracken, that says his son visited her when he was in the Marines at a different address. The FBI's investigation of Marguerite Claverie Oswald ended. They never interviewed employers or coworkers who knew and worked with Marguerite Claverie Oswald in Fort Worth at Clyde Campbell Men's Store, the City of Fort Worth, Paul's Shoe Store, Family Publications, or Cox's Department Store, or Avon Products. Nor did they obtain employment records or interviews of coworkers in New Orleans who knew and worked with Margaret Claverie Oswald at Burt's Shoe Store, Krieger's, Goldring's Department Store in 1955 and 1956. Nor did the FBI obtain employment records or interview employers or coworkers who knew and worked with Margaret Claverie Oswald at Goldring's or Krieger's in 1959, 60, 61, 62, 63. The FBI could easily have identified and confirmed Marguerite's employment history through state and federal withholding reports, Social Security contributions, federal and state tax returns. A detailed history of her employment and her home addresses could be easily ascertained by contacting former employers, obtaining beginning and ending dates of her employment, interviewing former coworkers, examining employment applications, pay records, contacting local credit bureaus, utility companies, banks, etc. They did nothing. The FBI intentionally avoided any company, any employer, any coworker who may have known or worked with Marguerite Claverie Oswald after the mid-1950s, 1955. They avoided these companies because former coworkers might refuse to identify the now well-publicized, short, heavy-set Margaret Oswald imposter as the woman they knew and worked with only a few years earlier. Store records would show the dates of her employment for Margaret Claverie Oswald, 1955 to 1963, while at the same time, the Margaret Oswald imposter was either unemployed, 1956 through 1958, visiting numerous doctors, receiving treatments following her injury, working as a practical nurse caretaker in various towns in North Texas. No, it couldn't. The FBI's intentional failure to investigate and make public the employment of Margaret Claverie Oswald is a clear indication that high-level FBI officials had knowledge of the two Margaret Oswalds. This may explain why not a single one of our federal income tax returns have ever been released and are marked referred, postponed in full, and remain unavailable to researchers. As a side note, from 1955 through the beginning of 1960, a period of 5 years, the only documented employment of the Marguerite Oswald imposter was a few months at Dolly's Shoe in New Orleans in 1955 and a few months at King Candy in 1958. Otherwise, she was unemployed. Today, what remains are an overwhelming number of FBI reports relating to the Margaret Oswald imposter. Beginning in 1955, as the number of FBI reports relating to Margaret Claverie Oswald diminished, the number of FBI reports relating to the Margaret Oswald imposter increased. By the spring of 1955, the Margaret Oswald imposter became the one and only Margaret Oswald, mother of the young man who would soon defect to the Soviet Union. From the early 1950s through 1963, the majority of the Margaret Oswald imposter's employment consisted of working as a bar, as a practical nurse, or as a caretaker where she was paid in cash. Working for cash and avoiding the use of the Social Security number eliminated the possibility that government records and credit bureaus would record the employment of two Margaret Oswalds at different locations at the same time. The Margaret Oswald imposter told the Warren Commission that she had worked for some of the wealthiest and most influential families in Fort Worth. In fact, The Margaret Oswald imposter was employed by the Carter family, owners of the Fort Worth Star-Telegram newspaper, in the months leading up to the assassination of President Kennedy. Now, how this elderly, financially destitute woman with no verifiable employment history was able to gain employment as a practical nurse with such a wealthy and influential family is unknown. And why her employment was terminated shortly before President Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas remains a mystery. When interviewed by the Warren Commission, Margaret Oswald imposter was handed written notes relating to the background of Margaret Clavery Oswald. Yet she made and continued to make mistakes in her testimony relating to the historical background of Margaret Clavery Oswald. A good example is when the Margaret Oswald imposter was asked by the Warren Commission if the father of Lee Oswald was right or left-handed. She replied, "I don't remember." We now understand, and we must never forget, that Margaret Clavery Oswald's federal tax returns remained classified, and the Social Security records for both Lee Harvey Oswald and Margaret Oswald have never been released. Warren Commission co-counsel Burt Griffin described the FBI's involvement and collaboration in the investigation of President Kennedy's murder. Griffin said, quote, "All of the records were in the hands of the two agencies, FBI, CIA, and if they so desired, any information or files could have been destroyed or laundered prior to the time the Commission could get them." Griffin was correct. These agencies had destroyed and laundered evidence in order to frame Harvey Oswald, conceal the existence of two Lee Harvey Oswalds, and conceal the existence of the two Margaret Oswalds. Evidence that, if made public, would have exposed the government agency responsible for their creation, the CIA. FBI official William Sullivan was well aware of the FBI's ability and willingness to withhold sensitive information. He said, quote, "When an enormous organization like the FBI with such tremendous power can sit back and shuffle the deck of cards and pick up the card they want to show you, it may be you're not going to get the entire picture as fully as you would otherwise." Sullivan knew the FBI was capable of withholding documents from the Warren Commission, documents which could prove there were two Lee Harvey Oswalds. Interestingly, on November 9, 1977, days before he was to testify before the House Select Committee, William C. Sullivan was walking through the woods near Sugar Hill, New Hampshire, on the way to meeting companions. Another hunter, Robert Daniels, a 22-year-old son of a state policeman, using a telescopic sight on a .30 caliber rifle, said he mistook Sullivan for a deer, shot him in the neck, and killed him instantly. The authorities called it an accident, fining Daniels $500 and taking away his hunting license for 10 years. Now, I made a list, which I'm not going to read. It's on the website, of 40 odd things that could have and should have happened if the FBI had conducted a proper investigation. For example, I'll read you a couple of them, but there's over 40. Imagine if the FBI had asked employees of Dolly Shoe, Mari Goodman, Louis Marzial, Rita Pavier, people who I've spoken with, to identify the 1957 photograph of Margaret Clavery Oswald, the photograph taken at Paul's Shoe Store, Christmas 1957, as their fellow co-worker in 1955. I sent each of these people a photograph of Margaret Clavery Oswald and of the Margaret Oswald imposter. All of these people identified the photograph of the Margaret Oswald imposter as their former co-worker and said they did not know the woman in the 1957 photo, the real Margaret Oswald Clavery. Just imagine if the FBI would have done something so simple. I'll read you another one. Imagine if the Warren Commission obtained employment records relating to Margaret Clavery Oswald from Burke's Shoe Store, Goldring's department store, Krieger's department store in New Orleans, from 1956 through 1961 and compared those with the employment of the Margaret Oswald imposter in Fort Worth for the same years. Imagine if the Warren Commission had the rental records from both 4936 Collinwood and 3830 West 6th for the years 1956 through 1958. Imagine if the Warren Commission had examined the Marine Corps unit diaries for September 1958, which placed Harvey Oswald in Taiwan, while at the same time Lee Oswald made numerous visits to the base hospital in Atsugi, Japan. How to explain that? Imagine if the Warren Commission took testimony from Frank Cudley, Fran Schubert, Doug Gann, Jackie Bobby Pitts, Roy Parkin, and other students who knew and were familiar with Harvey Oswald at Stripling in the fall of 1954. Anyway, there's 40 odd of these what-ifs on the website, and I would encourage people to read them. The bottom line is, if the FBI had simply done their job and conducted an honest investigation, we wouldn't be here today. Warren Commission member Richard Russell said, "They, the FBI, have tried the case and reached a verdict on every count." Russell then wrote a letter of resignation from the Warren Commission to Lyndon Johnson, but Johnson refused to accept his resignation. Warren Commission member Hale Boggs said, quote, "We've not been told the truth about Oswald. Boggs and Alaska Nick Begich vanished when their small plane disappeared in Alaska wilderness during a routine flight from Anchorage to Juneau. For what it's worth, I was in Alaska at that time. I remember waking up in the morning and asking one of my fellow coworkers what he thought, and he very simply said, they'll never find them, and they didn't." Warren Commission member John McCloy told the House Select Committee in 1978, "I no longer feel we have credible evidence or reliable evidence in regard to a conspiracy." Warren Commission member Senator John Sherman Cooper never agreed to the single bullet theory and expressed doubts to fellow members. The two Warren Commission members who remained committed to the conclusions of the Warren Report were, not surprisingly, former CIA Director Alan Dulles, who attended more Warren Commission meetings than any other member, and Gerald Ford, a man who described by Newsweek as the CIA's best friend in Congress. After leaving office, the man who created the Warren Commission, President Lyndon Johnson, expressed doubts about the Warren Commission's conclusion for the remainder of his life. On one occasion, he told his aide, Marvin Watson, that he was convinced there was a plot in connection with the assassination and, quote, felt the CIA had something to do with the plot. Lyndon Johnson was correct, but it has taken JFK researchers nearly a half century to arrive at the same conclusion.
Well, fantastic article. There's so much to think about. I'm sure people are going to have to read it 2-3 times and really let that soak in. There's just so much work you have done.
Len, the problem in all this is, the problem with the whole thing, the whole Kennedy thing has been everybody's waiting for a smoking gun. One sentence, one paragraph, one page that tells everybody what happened, and it's over and done with, and all arguments are gone. That's never going to happen. To figure out something that took a lot of preparation and years of work to produce is incredible. Len, it's like, I don't know, it's like if you tell a lie to your wife, to your coworkers or whatever. The lie takes what? 5 seconds, 10 seconds? But if other coworkers were to question that lie, how long would it take them to go through all of the reasons to explain why they think you're lying? It's the same thing here. It's going to take people lots and lots of time and effort to uncover all of these things. And the one thing that we must never forget is what we have learned, we're not supposed to know. And it doesn't matter whether it's, dict about recordings, the number of shots, and medical evidence, 2 Oswalds, whatever. We're not supposed to know any of this. The Warren Commission was supposed to be the final authority. There it is. Here's your proof. End of story. Well, enough people saw enough holes in that it's taken people like you and me and others to work through these things, and the time and the effort to try and find the real answers. And when you try and uncover something as bizarre, I don't know if that's the word, as two Oswalds, two Marguerites, and so on, you have to really, really, really dig, because, like I said, we're not supposed to know any of this information. And sometimes just the slightest little sentence, the slightest few words will change everything. I mean, I'll never forget the first time I read Robert Oswald's Warren Commission testimony. He attended Stripling Junior High. Well, okay, so what? Well, as I started to dig into the two Oswalds, I looked up Stripling Junior High. By golly, it's in Fort Worth, and one thing led to another, and then you start reading old newspaper articles and this and that, and you find out that Robert said that half a dozen times. By golly, maybe there's something to it. But the whole point is, a few words can open up a can of worms that where there might be some real truth behind an innocent comment. It goes back, and two things strike me just in the face in all my research. One is when Virginia Davis was asked by the Warren Commission, she was talking about Oswald after the Tippit shooting. He disappeared around the side of my house and blah, blah. And then the attorney asked her, well, how long was it that the police showed up? They were already here. And those few words, they were already here. That changes everything. How could they have been there? What's going on? It's the same thing as when I looked at the money order, the postal money order in the Warren volumes. I mean, I've been in business, construction, oil business all my life. And I learned a long time ago, when other people are signing checks, I had an office and I had people signing checks. You have a responsibility to yourself to physically look at every single check, make sure every single check is valid, payment where it's supposed to be made, and so on. So, my accountant told me to have the check sent to not my office, but to my personal residence and inspect every one of them. And so, anyway, the point I'm trying to make is I was very familiar with checks. And when I saw this money order that doesn't have a single bank stamp on it, it took me about 2 seconds to wait a minute. This thing was never run through a bank. I mean, it's right there in front of you. This money order was not cashed or deposited at a bank. There's not a single bank stamp on it. And that one little thing like that can change everything. So I would encourage people to not just to read a book, but to slowly read and slowly piece together the pieces of the puzzle so that you become very familiar with them. Then and only then are you able to look at other information and piece these small items together.
Well, they're not so small, but
no, but you have to piece these things together like you would build a house, one brick at a time.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
after you build the brick, anyway.
I'd like to ask you this, John. Would you be prepared to come on a little later, maybe in a couple of weeks, and talk about this again? Because it occurred to me that for people listening, and then they're going to go read your article and look at all the photos and everything, they might have questions. And I thought maybe I should canvass that people write in questions to me, and then I'll bring them up. I'll read them out loud on the next time I have you on, and we can address them, because we've already been like 2 hours already. So I just thought, I'm sure people have as many questions as I can think up, and maybe that might be a better way to have an opportunity for researchers to pose a question to you through Black Op Radio.
Lynn, look, I encourage people, and I want people to look at all the research. I mean, look, my research is just one, branch of a tree. I mean, there's many branches, there's many twigs, and there's many everythings, and I'm just one small part of it. whether they read my research or other research, it's all the same. Try to understand what's going on. Try to put yourself in the position where you understand it, like you're an inside person, like a fly on the wall who's heard everything. And then you can ask good, detailed questions. The problem I've always had with the two Oswalds is when you present this information to somebody who's never heard it before, then imagine I'm going to give a presentation to two Oswalds in front of a group of college students or something who've never heard it, weren't around in 1963. They're going to ask questions because they don't understand the subject matter like I do, and they're going to ask questions which I think would make me think, just read my stuff, it's all in there. So I've tried to avoid people who are not serious about the Kennedy thing. I've got many friends and many associates in this Kennedy JFK research, but I've limited those people to the people who are very serious-minded, understand, ask good detailed questions, and I'll spend hours with those people. But I don't want to answer questions that are unrelated to my work or to my research or my interests. Like, for example, if somebody were to ask me, how many shooters were there? I'm not interested at all. Well, who did it? The Russians or Cubans? I'm just not interested.
Oh, right. Well, you wouldn't get that from people listening to Black Op Radio. They would have had to heard this. They would have to be interested in your research and have, I'm just saying, questions about this article in particular.
Yes. If the good, serious questions that need to be answered, I'll spend all day answering questions, all day. I've got, my time is unlimited for these people.
Okay. Well, let me do that. I will send you a list of questions by email, and then we can at another time address them and discuss them.
Yeah, that's fine. That's fine.
Good, good.
And by the way, no, Lynn, I'm open to that in everything I've done. Every single thing I've done with you, I'm open to that. I want people. Look, Lynn, I made a decision years ago that I had to write a book. And it's certainly not to make money. Nobody makes money writing. I'm sure you're making a mint off of Black Op Radio, right?
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Well, I'm sure you understand I'm making a mint off of my stuff too. No, I wrote the book for one reason, and that is, I don't know if you call it selfish concern. I don't know what the right word is, but I'm not going to be around in 30 years. I'll be gone. But I want the work that I have done to benefit someone, anyone who's still interested in this. I don't want to have this people go through the same years of work and toil that I have. Take my work, please. Chop it apart. Don't believe it. I don't care. But there's stuff in there that has taken me years to find and piece together, and if you can use it, by all means, use it. You don't need to credit me. You don't need to do anything. I think I've found enough information to make people ask a lot of questions and go in, what I think may be the right direction. And my goal was always just to simply show people what I've done. You don't believe it? That's fine. I don't care. But here it is. In other words, I don't want to die taking this information with me. And for that matter, I don't want to be, I don't want my name to be out there like oh, he said this and oh, he said that. I don't want any publicity from this. If you could call me John Smith, I'd be just as happy.
Well, I think anybody who's read your research, your book, Harvey and Lee, respects the amount of work you put into it. I've heard many people do that, in spite of them saying, "I'm not sure I follow all of it." But you've got to admire John's research. I mean, you list it all there. And sometimes even for me, some of the things are a little too over my head. I just, how can that be? How can these two addresses? How do you solve that puzzle?
You saw that puzzle by digging into it more and more and more and more and more until you do understand. Then, look, my history of study, work, whatever. I'll give you an example. I wanted to learn how to type in high school. I thought someday that would be important to learn how to type. So I took a typing class. And my God, these gals with their little fingers could just type like crazy, and me and my big clumsy hands, I couldn't do shit. Well, one weekend, I went home, and I typed this, practice thing. And then, oh my gosh, I left my typing book at school. So I had to type the same one sheet thing again. And it was a weekend. Then I typed it again. And what I noticed was every time I typed the same piece of paper, it became easier. It's kind of like watching the same movie over and over and over and over. You learn a little bit more about the movie and what they're trying to do every time you read it, especially some of these spy things. So what that taught me was, forget trying to do something one time. You're not going to get it. You've got to read it, wait a minute, go back and read it again, go back and read it again, go back and read it again, to where you really understand, if that's what you want to do. You've got to repeat it over and over and over and over. And that's been my life. If you want to be a success, look, your video stuff. You have learned to be an expert video producer again and again and again, and you're not a novice. And that's the way we learn, is by doing things again and again and again and again and again. So for you to read my research and understand it the first or the second time would be like me trying to edit your video stuff. And, Len, I don't understand it. And you're thinking, God, this is so simple. What do you mean you don't understand it? Well, that's the same thing with me. Two addresses. Len, why don't you understand it? It's simple.
Very good, John. I just always enjoy listening to you and speaking to you. Well, let's do that. Let me set up maybe in two weeks or so. I'll canvas for people. If you've heard this interview, go to John's article, harveyandlee.net. Read it. I'll fax you. Email my age. I'll email you my questions along with people who've decided to write in, and we'll see what other traction we can get out of this. But
yes,
again.
And Lynn, I do. Please, pretty please, tell your people when you say I've got a new interview by John Armstrong and Margaret Oswald. Please say John respectfully requests, in parentheses, insists, however you want to say it, that you follow his reading of this thing and looking at the pictures at the same time on your computer. When they see these pictures and they see, it's one thing to say that the eyebrows are slanted. It's another thing to look at this woman and think, my God, I mean, those are some really slanted eyebrows. It's a big difference. Oh, and another thing. Now, after I've shared with you all this stuff about the two Marguerite Oswalds, I'm going to tell you something that Jim Mars told me, and I just shook my head and kind of laughed. He said, when I met Marguerite Oswald and we said goodbye, she handed me her business card. And I said, okay. And he said, you know what it said? I said, no. Her business card said, Margaret Oswald, mother of Lee Harvey Oswald. She's still trying to convince people that she's the mother of Lee Harvey Oswald.
All right, John. Well, I look forward to talking to you again because we've already been over 2 hours, so I'll give your voice a break for today, and that'll help.
See you.
Yeah, with other people writing in and my questions as well, and so we'll look forward to that.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for the time and effort that you've put into this research, and thank you again for the time that you've put in today and help organizing it, because it's really worthwhile.
Very good.
All right.
Have a nice evening.
Thank you. Good night.